Thanks to Matthias and the Tech Academy for asking me to give a talk here. Uh, I was kind of wrestling with, Matthias actually contacted me, I think maybe a month or a month and a half back, and talking about presentations, and I was trying to figure out whether or not I wanted to do something that was a little bit more like tech stack specific, but so a little bit about my background. Career development is near and dear to me. Before I was a software engineer, I worked in career development for lawyers and law students. I used to be a lawyer. And so I know that coming from a non-traditional background and getting into the tech industry as a software engineer, you kind of have a lot of imposter syndrome. And there's a lot of questions you have about like, what's the format? Like, is it consistent? How do I best prepare? And this is sort of my presentation that's kind of coalescing of a lot of one-on-one mentorships that I do. I ad hoc mentor dozens of software engineers, lawyers, law students over the course of like 10 or 11 years. And this is kind of what I've kind of picked from all those experiences. So it will seem really dense, but it's also something that I'm hoping that the Tech Academy will be able to share these slides afterwards so you can refer to it. There'll be links there. I have a cool coding problem like at the end that I'd love for y'all to take a look at, and I set up a Slack for people to kind of like submit things and like have a discussion about it afterwards. But if you all don't mind, I'd love to get started right away. So who am I? I'm this guy. So this is me with long hair, which is not what I used to have when I was a lawyer. I had very short hair. And actually, like, thanks to me fundraising for Movember to raise money for men's health and mental health awareness, like my hair is blonde currently. That was sort of the prize for people who donated the most amount of money for the cause. But a little bit about my background. I went to the Tech Academy in 2017 after a long career of being a lawyer and working with lawyers and law students from non-traditional backgrounds, people who did not have exposure growing up to a lawyer in their family or did not know a judge or a lawyer. And so we're coming at it blind, usually things like first to go to college or coming from maybe like a 9-to-5 blue collar job and then like got their credits, went to college and then went to law school. So like again, I think a lot of where people who are coming into the Tech Academy are at, where they're making either a huge career shift from something that they've done for a number of years, or they were kind of just like, they were working a regular 9-to-5 job and decided that this was something that spoke to them. Could I get a poll of everybody who's here right now in terms of who's currently a Tech Academy student? Okay, and then how many of you are in the process of looking for jobs right now? Okay, awesome. So there's like a nice mix of people who are like currently going through the education process and making the transition, and then people who are like maybe are just looking for something like refreshers or tips or strategies to help kind of smooth along that process and make it a little less painful, because it's quite frankly very painful. I'm currently a data engineer at Flux. This is my second job as a software engineer outside of the Tech Academy. And we're actually a company that focuses on internal mobility. So how do you as an employee within a company not get lost and fall through the cracks in terms of promotions, in terms of lateral opportunities, in terms of skill training? So we provide a platform that takes a lot of HR data and personal data about yourself that you as an employee give, and we have a contract with you to use your data in a way that benefits you. And so what that means is, we try to expose within the company like all the different types of job opportunities that are available. We try to make sure that when you are submitting an application, that is a seamless process, and that you can get recommended for things based off of things that skills that you thought maybe weren't directly relevant to a particular job that you're at, but might be awesome for a job that you might have never thought about. So that's kind of what I work with. That's the platform that I work with right now. And as a data engineer, I deal with a lot of productionizing data science experiments and models into pipelines that run, maybe they're on a schedule, maybe they're event-driven, and we try to make it so that we can get useful insights for analytics, for predictions, so that, again, people are being exposed and the process of promotion and the process of growth is transparent within the organization. There are links here to some, if you want to know a little bit more about my background, there's a link there to a Max List interview or spot that I gave. I also have a link to our company website, which is fairly bare, but we have both a Medium article talking about remote work, because I work as part of a distributed team in San Francisco, New York City, and Portland, as well as an article that just came out, I think today, or a couple of days ago, with respect to what our mission is and why it's important to look for talent inside your company when you've already invested in a candidate and now an employee. So that's the long and short of it as to who I am. So I want to start out with a simple thesis with respect to tech interviews. Tech interviews suck. They are horrible for many reasons, and we can count them many ways, but here are some of the reasons that I think particularly grind my gears when I think about tech interviews. Tech interviews are varied and inconsistent in their format, content, and execution. You got 30-minute phone interviews, hour-long coding challenges, hour-and-a-half on-sites, 8-hour take-home problems, 24-hour, 48-hour challenges, and they all use different stacks. They all use different resources, like maybe they'll make you go to a website and solve a coding challenge there. Maybe they'll ask you to describe an architecture and whiteboard something on the spot of something that you've worked on before. The fact of the matter is that there is a panoply of different types of ways for you to get evaluated and for you to go through the job interview process. And that sucks because you want consistency to a certain extent. Second point, many in tech are biased in their belief that their interview processes are objective and meritocratic. And that's because a lot of them are focused on coding challenges. And everybody thinks, oh, coding's a very objective thing. It's very mathematical, it's very logical, and therefore it must be an objective measure by which we go and evaluate somebody's capabilities. But it's not, for many reasons, including the fact that that only speaks to you being in the moment under a time pressure situation where you're trying to figure out a problem that you've never seen before and maybe will never encounter at work, but it doesn't count for all the lead up in terms of how you got your foot in the door, how you made an impression on the interviewer, and little idiosyncrasies like tabs versus spaces. If you get on somebody's wrong end about that, maybe that'll ding you and you'll never even know. The point is that I think it's foolish for any industry, especially the tech industry, to say that there's a purely objective measure of your capabilities. So feel comfortable and confident in the reality that everybody's a liar with respect to their objectivity. And furthermore, this is the part that I went through when I was most recently applying for jobs a year ago, was that bad tech interviews force engineers to toxically focus on solving abstract challenges that have nothing to do with the data table. I don't know, how many of you have taken a coding challenge off of a website or a 30-minute challenge where they say solve some algorithm? Can I just raise a show of hands? And how many of you felt like that was something that was relevant to the work that you had been doing up to this point in time? Nobody. Right, exactly. I will say that now that I am in this job at Flux, I do occasionally, once in a while, have a algorithms issue where I'm thinking about optimization, but it's not a let's go and take an array of arrays and make them into a flat array. It's not a problem like that. It's usually something along the lines of, guess what? We're spending a lot of money on AWS right now. We need to figure out a less intensive way for us to go and transform code or transform data. So again, these abstractions are maybe useful to say a quick yes or a quick no, but it's not applicable with regard to what your actual performance day-to-day is. So why are y'all here? I asked you, and I asked kind of where you are in your stages of life, and I had a few guesses, not meeting anybody prior to today, which is maybe you're struggling to figure out how to tackle whiteboarding problems and code challenges, like a very directed sort of I need that extra push that makes me feel like I'm doing things in a consistent manner and maximizing my chances of succeeding in a tech interview. Maybe you're like me, where you found it hard, or you find it hard to sound credible to employers because you don't have any software experience in your job history. Maybe you've got 10 years working in white collar job in some other industry, and you're like, now I have to abandon all of these experiences where I felt like I've grown as an individual and a professional. How do I bring that in? And the answer is there are ways to do that, and I'll talk a little bit more about those strategies. Or maybe you've never been in a white collar job, you've never been in an office environment, and you've had a blue collar job, you've worked in in the service industry, or you've worked with your hands, or in a vocational industry, and you just feel like this is like a crazy new world where nothing makes sense and it's entirely foreign to you. So my plea to you is let's figure this all out together. So what are my qualifications? I talked a little bit about this in my introduction, but I don't like the prestige model. I don't like talking about degrees, and I don't like talking about titles. I like talking about deliverables and things that I feel are meaningful to me. So if you want to look at all that stuff, you can find me on LinkedIn. It's pretty simple. Chris Lang, long hair. It's that same photo that I have in my presentation. But here is what I think are the most important qualifications that I can bring to the table. I've screwed up like every interview possible in the course of 11 years. I graduated law school and became a licensed attorney in 2009 when the economy sucked. And I have a folder on my Dropbox of like 100 job interviews, or 100 jobs that I applied to in a year and a half, where 99% of them never gave me a call back. And that was me, like custom writing cover letters, making sure that my resume was tailored to every job, and like fretting over like all the little, like what were the marginal things that I could have done to excel. And frankly, sometimes the job market is the luck of the draw. And that was a hard lesson that I had to learn. So I've made every mistake. I've said too much, or I've said too little. And so you can learn from my experiences of being an idiot. And I hope that you will. As I mentioned, I interviewed or reviewed candidates in a lot of settings: academia, the public sector, the private sector, law school admissions, judicial endorsements, lawyer jobs, software engineering jobs. So I have, I think, a broad set of experiences to talk about different types of interviews and sort of like what is quantitative versus what is qualitative, and just kind of to set you a little bit at ease about what this process looks like. In addition to running interviews and conducting interviews, I also ran career development programs when I was a diversity professional in the law. That's mentorship programs, orientation programs, job placement programs. I've seen many people and counseled many people on an individual or a group basis about how to make these transitions strategically. And finally, I'm a bootcamp grad from here. I've made the transition, and I have my second position in tech, and hopefully I'll have more positions in tech. And then we can someday be colleagues together. So with all that introduction in place, I want to talk about how I want to structure the tips and strategies that I want to present to you. And again, like I said, this is this part where it's the meat and potatoes and it's really dense. So one thing I learned from law school was always start with a roadmap, because we always get sidetracked by shiny things. I was up until I think 4 a.m. this morning, just finally revising slides, and I did 2 dry runs of this presentation. And I was like, oh, if I didn't have these slides, I'd be talking about this and talking about that anecdote, because I've got lots of cocktail party stories that would excite and entertain everybody, but I have to, reel myself in and get to the point. So here are sort of the 4 areas that I want to tackle today. General professional strategies for all industries. So this is something that will apply whether or not you're a software engineer, you're a lawyer, you're going to work in an office environment. These are things that will will be useful for you throughout the life of your career. How to embrace the coding bootcamp background, or in this case, also the non-traditional background. How do you make that into not what is a perceived weakness on your end, but actually a source of strength? And then we'll move on to coding strategies and tips. So kind of, again, what I call the vegetables of tech interviews. You know it sucks, but you know that you need to do this in order to go and land a job. So on some level, you have to do some preparation. So we'll talk a little bit about resources there and kind of like what I went through when I was going through these kinds of interviews. And then finally, I have a take-home coding challenge for everybody. And at the end of this presentation, I have set up a Slack workspace and kind of instructions by how you can communicate with me, and we can collaborate on this problem together. And this is a problem that I've worked on with a number of the people that I've mentored, even in the course of this last 2.5 years that I've been in this new industry. So this is something that I've developed that kind of eases people into this process without going hardcore in terms of like, let's do data structures and algorithms. All right, so let's start with general professional strategies. And a lot of you are going to think, when you see these as bullet points, these are incredibly obvious, and quite honestly, They are. They're supposed to be, but because we think they're obvious, we never implement them because we think, oh, it should be natural, but it's not. They're all learned skills. They're obvious, but we never use them. First of all, we want to network. Like the job interview starts before you actually, submit an application for a job or you see a job posting. It is making sure that you are known and your presence is known in this community, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't suck for you. Something that, remember that at the end of the day, you're an individual and you're asking to be hired as an individual professional, so you shouldn't have to force yourself to go and be something that you're not completely. We talk a lot in the diversity industry about what is your authentic self, what is being genuine, and bringing your entire self to the table when you work into a professional environment. And so some of you may hear or get emails from organizations like the Tech Academy where they say, here's a networking event that you go to. There'll be a ton of people from the industry here. There'll be like 200 people in attendance or whatever. If you have anxiety about those things, don't go at it alone. Don't try to go into this thing and jump into the deep end. There's lots of little things that you can do to make it easier for yourself. I say use the buddy system at networking events. Have a friend to come with you because that friend is your lifesaver, and by that same token, you are their lifesaver. Go and have a conversation with somebody who's super intimidating, and if you feel like you're lagging in the conversation, let that person jump in and kind of save you. That way, you don't get as many of those awkward pauses. You have somebody familiar, and it automatically puts you at a higher level of ease than you would be if you were to just go alone in an environment where maybe some people have been drinking in the evening, or have been just getting off of work and maybe are stressed out. You have all these emotions and chaos happening. Let's make things a little less chaotic. Again, don't go to things that you're not excited about. If somebody's like, AWS is the most awesome thing, go to this AWS thing, and you're like, I don't want to do AWS stuff. Like, I want to do, I just want to go and work on my Java code right now, and or go to a video game meetup. I don't want to talk about cloud services. Don't go to them. Go to the things that interest you, because at the end of the day, those are the things that you will be able to show a genuine interest toward when you're at the interview, and those are the people that you want to meet. If you don't want to go to going to networking events at all, do one-on-ones. We preach this in the legal field, where you could go and cold call any lawyer and say, hey, I'm really interested in learning more about you. Can I treat you to a coffee? And what I would say is make cold asks for coffee dead simple to say yes to. So you want the only response when you make a cold email ask or a cold phone call to a professional is to say yes to the schedule and recommendations and suggestions that you've made. So you can go and say, hi, my name is Chris. I really was looking at your LinkedIn profile. I was really interested in learning more about what you do at this company. I see that you work downtown. I would love to take you out for a coffee. I don't know what your schedule is, but I can give you a couple of dates that will work out for you. I generally am free on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and I don't know if you're free on any of those days. Could I suggest a 10 a.m. coffee? That way, the only response that they can say is either yeah, and because you've done all the work for them, and they can go back to coding or doing whatever they have to do for their day-to-day responsibilities, or it's a no but, and they can have the further conversation about negotiating with you, what is a schedule that works for the both of you. I've seen too many emails, too many communications about getting together to meet falter because nobody wants to go and throw out the first date. It's a simple thing, but again, our primitive brains want to have some sort of structure and want to have some sort of simplicity. We want to get to the quickest answer possible. So let's make answers to get to know people as easy as possible. And if you're still kind of I don't know if I can do a one-on-one thing, I don't know if I can cold call somebody, I'm still very nervous, find a good mentor or a mentoring program. There are a ton of organizations around town that have mentoring programs. I mentor under Emerging Leaders, which gets people from non-traditional backgrounds entering into the tech industry. They're kind of primarily, their whole strategy, I think, is to partner with different types of organizations that do job trainings, and then they also have a mentorship program that they can plug into. I've also mentored in the past for PDX Women in Tech. They have an amazing mentorship program. I'm trying to keep in contact with my current set of mentees. One is abroad and the other one has been going through, like life circumstances, so sometimes it's not as regular. You have to kind of build these organic relationships. But again, a mentoring program means that you're seeking out somebody who's already made the priority of wanting to help somebody out. So that is a great way to start. Build relationships before you lean on them. Now, I made this mistake a ton as a baby lawyer because I was like, I've got a 1-year-old that I need to feed. My partner is a law student. We're not making any money. I've got to go and get a job right away. So I would make the mistake all the time that I would introduce myself and say, hi, I'm Chris. I'm really looking for a job right now. And, is your firm hiring? And immediately turns people off. Nobody wants to feel used. We have, and again, when I say build relationships for leaning on them, you have to go into it with the mindset that maybe by serendipity, you will find somebody who says, actually, there's an opportunity for you, but what you're doing is you're planting the seeds for a year down the line, 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line. You're building those relationships that when you are maybe like you've been at your first job for a year and you're like, man, there's no traction here. I need to find better opportunities. Now you have somebody who's gotten to know you and can go to bat for you and put their neck on the line for you. Build the relationships now. Don't just plan for now, plan for the future. Calendar and track everything to keep you sane. Again, like I said, with the whole making the coffee as easy as possible, make your life easy in terms of what your life priorities are. I have my work calendar has a bunch of random stuff that's not work related. Because as soon as I put it on the calendar, I tell my bosses and I say to them, hey, obviously I have all these work priorities, but these are also important to me in my life. So if you're going to schedule a meeting, you're going to have to schedule around these things. And just follow that calendar, because I've seen, a lot of legal professionals who say all the time, I can't volunteer, or I can't work on this side project, or I can't, I want to get back into woodworking, but I don't have the time to do it. And it's frankly BS, because if you went ahead of time and put the time in and then said the calendar is sacrosanct, then you've prioritized this thing. It's because we need these psychological cues that make things tangible and real, and that's what we're using the calendar as a proxy for. So I know it sounds silly, do it, trust me, it'll feel a lot more easy for you to say, look, the calendar told me I need to go and do this. And just use that as your excuse. You can tell them that I told you to do that. And then also, with regard to calendaring, when you're applying for jobs, in a similar way, track your progress. And I think the Tech Academy does this within their job search module. They'll make you write a spreadsheet, have a spreadsheet where you list where you are in every stage of every application that you apply to. Very useful, because then you can have little reminders to yourself to be, I need to follow up and send an email to the recruiter. I need to go and submit a material or supplementary materials. I need to go and schedule something. Let those things not reside in your brain. Put them in somewhere where you can access them in a clear and comprehensive way. And along the same lines, let little preparations ground you and maintain your confidence. So if you have little rituals, maybe you like to go, maybe you feel more confident with an iron shirt. Something simple like that. Do these things, ground yourself and make yourself feel as comfortable as possible, so that all you have to worry about is sort of being able to present or have to go and rationalize or reason your way through a coding problem. Don't let all the other things that make you feel uncomfortable or not confident bubble up to the surface. Control as much as you can with regard to your personal rituals, and take your time when you're doing things. Sometimes even just resetting in the middle of something and just taking a breath. That will get you centered, that will get you to think, and just refocus your attention on what is actually important when you're going through a communication with somebody or an interview with somebody. And finally, for the general professional strategist, use elevator speeches the right way. How many of you have had to have written things on a card to prepare for a speech or presentation? You raise a hand. And how many of you, when you actually give the presentation, literally read from the cards?
Paraphrase, maybe.
Paraphrase. That's good, because that's where you want to be. Again, your purpose of you making these elevator speeches, talking in the mirror, talking in the car. I was talking in the car on my way over here, trying to build up an intro to how I would give this presentation. That is so that you can feel confident that if you're stumbling, that you can refer back to something. But honestly, best case scenario, you just entirely forget it, and it's like jazz or improvisation or whatever metaphor you want to use. Like the elevator speeches are another way to ground yourself, and also it allows you to hone what your identity is, who you are as an individual. What have all the years of you living and all the experiences you've gone to produced in terms of you as an individual? That is a story and a narrative that you need to lock in for yourself, regardless of whether you're a software engineer or in any other type of job context. Cool. So now we're done with the 101 general stuff, and we're going to talk about specifically about coming from a non-traditional background in software into the tech industry. So here's the thing about comparing yourself against a computer science major who's gone through a 4-year institution. They have 4 years on you. Can't beat that. They've had an opportunity to do multiple internships. Can't beat that. But what differentiates a CS person from somebody who's going through a boot camp is that the prioritization on the curriculum, or the prioritization for those of you coming from a non-traditional background, is practical experience. And so I know that for those in the audience who are still going through the program and haven't actually worked a job as an engineer, you're like, well, shoot, I don't have the job experience, the practical experience on the job. Guess what? A lot of the projects that you work on can be refactored, can be built upon to simulate that sort of real work experience. And that's why I always tell every bootcamp person that I'm mentoring, have at least one project that you know like the back of your hand. I mentor a lot of graduates and students from Alchemy Code Lab, which is next to Powell. And their curriculum differs a little bit from Tech Academy, in which they do a lot of group-based projects and under like tight deadlines. So they'll have like 4 days where they're like, I need to spin up this app that does something. And so they divide up responsibilities, so they're not working on the whole project. Maybe they're working on, I'm creating the API endpoint, or I'm creating the front-end page, or I'm doing CSS styling, or something like that. Know with particularity what your responsibilities were and what you did, and be able to communicate that in a succinct way, but you also need to be in charge of the entire project, at least to be able to describe that beyond somebody who's just looking at it for the first time. That means you've engaged in thoughtfulness as to the holistic application of your product, and that's something that speaks to skills that you're going to need day to day as an engineer, because nobody wants to groom an engineer for growth or success in the industry if all they're focused on is the singular bug ticket that they're working on, the singular feature that they're adding to the system. They want you to talk about, or think about at least, what the product roadmap is, what this is going to look like a year down the line, 2 years down the line. So, I mean, so you have to engage, and if you have a team project, that's awesome. Sit down with your team, or if you worked on a group project with somebody, and just tech share all the parts that you've worked on, so that everybody has knowledge shared with each other, and everybody can speak intelligently about the project that they're working on. But here are some of the 4 points that I think that, regardless of whether it's an individual project or a group project, you should be able to answer. Can you describe your stack and walk through the code that you worked on? Can you say, well, I leveraged this third-party API and then connected it into our own API service so that I transformed that data from 2 APIs and to create a new data structure that we use to display a visualization on our front end. Can you draw out the architecture on a whiteboard? If you don't want to talk about code, and you don't want to go and write the code down because that's frankly exhausting, you have to be able to draw the diagram out. You have to be able to kind of, in big picture ways, show the relationships between, different parts of your service and how they interact with each other. What are the data contracts between them? How are they enforced? Can you honestly describe the good and the bad? Don't BS about what's awesome about your project and what sucks about your project. Be straightforward and honest about it, because that thoughtfulness, because we launch products at Flux right now where we know that there's tech debt, we know that there's bugs, we know that there's optimizations, and we need to be able to clearly express those so that we can write those tickets in our backlog to fix. It means that you're thinking long term. And finally, can you talk about something that you would change, something you would add? Feature development. It's not good enough that you say, I created a web page that took payroll data from public payroll data from New York City, and now I have a time series graph. That's my product. That's the project that I worked on. Talk about what else interests you and how you would go and change and add a feature to that project. Maybe it's what if I added a UI that allowed me to nudge those numbers so I could project and see how a change in the payroll, in the total payroll, would affect over time. You know, like be able to, even if you haven't implemented it, be able to talk thoughtfully about what kind of things, what are the things that you really want, and kind of what are the technologies that you think would apply in order to get that feature. And I mean, again, I can't emphasize enough that the project is sort of, that's your Bible, that's your work experience, that's something that you can really latch onto and build a base layer, a baseline of confidence. The next tip and strategy I would say is don't hide your non-software background because it's still relevant. As I said before, you've got CS majors who have limited office experience. You being able to interact with other human beings in an office environment, engage in conflict resolution, and able to talk about planning and strategizing, to even just like, again, being able to be disciplined enough to work a 9-to-5 job, that is a plus. And you need to show that you're just not coming out of the ether with like no job experience at all, and then you just went to Tech Academy. You want to, I mean, I've talked with people who, for instance, somebody who is an auto mechanic before going to Alchemy Code Lab, and he didn't want to talk about his auto mechanic experience at all. And I said, no, that's great, because you know what is it? What, you know, like as an auto mechanic, what are you doing? Somebody brings a car to you, and maybe they know what the problem is, or maybe they don't know what the problem is. So there's diagnosis. That's sort of like bug testing or QA. Then you have to go and like interact with the system that identifies with specificity what those problems are. So you're interacting with some kind of an interface or a computer system. Then you're not going to just randomly dink around and like unscrew things or unbolt things until something gets fixed. You're going to come up with a plan or a strategy, and you're going to execute upon it. That's the same thing as a tech design document. That's the same thing as writing tickets and being able to work task by task in a methodical way in order to accomplish the goal of fixing your car. That is software development experience right there. Go through the exercise, even if it seems silly, and try to convert all of the work that you've done into software-like equivalents. And if you have trouble with it, contact me, we'll talk about it. We can do a one-on-one, and I'll talk about your experience, and we'll figure out what's the right way to go about it. Try to port, yeah, so as I said, try to port your non-tech experience to a tech context. And also, finally, like, I don't know how many of you like have made resumes before where there's that personal interest section, and you're just kind of like, well, I don't know if anybody needs to know that I play the banjo or I really like barbecue or whatever. I've had so many stories from people where the first thing of like, oh, I'm going to put this guy to the side was, oh, he was a clown and a carny 10 years ago? Like, I'm totally going to go and talk to this guy just to hear that story. These little things are what distinguishes you in a stack of applications and a stack of resumes. These are the things that will make you stand out. So don't just throw them away. Think about them in a considered way. Be open-minded about opportunities, but specific about your interests. Frankly, for many of you who are just coming out of boot camp or in the middle of boot camp, you haven't figured out whether or not you care more or less about one side of the stack or not, and that's okay. You can, and that's okay to communicate to a potential employer, to say, you know, right now I don't have any sort of particular area that I absolutely want to emphasize, but I like working on these kinds of things. Don't shut yourself out from opportunities where you could end up finding out that if you're a front-end person and you like design, but you had the right job, full stack job that had a back-end component, that you actually like playing with data because it's contextual to you. Just to give you a bit of my background in more particularity, I was an environmental science major in college, never had an environmental science job. I had an environmental law certificate from Lewis and Clark Law School, never practiced in environmental law. I worked in insurance defense and estate and trust litigation and diversity work. All those things that I had no formal training for before coming into software. And then software, I was kind of like, well, maybe I kind of like data or whatever. And I worked as a full stack engineer, and I was able to figure out over time that I do prefer working on data, but I got the opportunity to work on maintaining a dashboard that was written very poorly because of outdated technologies, using things like Angular 1 when we're on Angular, whatever, like 8 or 9 or something like that, like incredibly deprecated technologies. but it gave me the opportunity because I expressed that I wanted to be flexible. Admit your gaps and redirect to your strengths. I personally went through this experience during a phone interview for my first job at Vacasa. I had a phone interview where they started to ask me a bunch of conceptual questions about things like, tell me the difference between parallelism and concurrency, or describe to me dependency injection. And I was like, well, I'm going to just reason this out and just kind of give what I think is a reasonable answer based on guesses, really just guesses. But I told them up front, I said, hey, I don't know the technical definition for this, but I can infer when you talk about parallelism versus concurrency, I know what it means to do something in parallel, and I know what it means, like just English-wise, what it means to do something concurrently, so here's my guess. And taking 5 seconds to admit you don't know something is way better than, in terms of setting expectations, than like bumbling through and me trying to give a definition like for 5 minutes and then be like, oh, well, maybe I don't know this or not, or maybe I've fooled everybody. Always be honest in terms of your expectations, in terms of what other people should expect from you. If you don't have the exact answer or skill, but you have a reasonable alternative, so like if somebody asks you, what's a good one? Have you worked with JavaScript before? And you said, on a JavaScript project, like for an API, and you said, no, but I mean, like I've done something similar in Python, and here's some of the code that I worked on if you're interested in looking at it. Redirect to your strength. It is not a yes or no answer in terms of, oh, you have this background and you have this skill. You have it, great. You don't, you're out. Find out what the alternative is. Be thoughtful about what they're really asking you. They're not asking you if you know JavaScript. They're asking you if you've worked in these types of projects with this type of language. And again, like I said before, educated guesses are fine, but caveat the hell of that out of them before you move on and talk about something. And finally, you have the interview, you manage to do deploy all of my strategies, and you still kind of feel like anxious about the whole process because you didn't get 100% of things right. Show initiative, reflection after the interview. Just because you're done with the interview doesn't mean suddenly the line of communication is cut off. And I, again, did this with my interview at Vacasa that led me to get an on-site interview and led me to get a position there. Was that I told my interviewer up front, I said, hey, I know that I really had a hard time working on some of these questions. If I was given the opportunity to go on site, what are some things that I could further study to prepare myself for the on-site interview? And he actually, to his credit, gave me like a list of 5 things that he said, like, study this language or this framework and study like containers or something like that, because we were talking about deployment in virtualized containers. And I did that. I didn't do it, I didn't become an expert at it in the time it took for me to get on site, but I at least showed the thoughtfulness up front so that when they asked me questions about things, I could say, yeah, I started looking into this, and this is what I know from at this point in time. It means that you are committed to this job. You are committed to learning on the job. Yes?
When did you ask the interviewer for feedback? Were you gone in an email, or literally right at the end when they go, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, good question. So like in that particular example, I gave it at the end of the phone interview, and I just was like, hey, thank you for taking, and as part of that interview too, like he had asked me something about just sort of like class-based coding, and I said, well, I haven't done anything in PHP related to that, and then I made him look, I suggested he look at my GitHub, and he was looking at it during the interview, which is, again, I think that's probably a rarer thing too. But yeah, I found an opportunity at the end to say, hey, I'm still really excited about applying for this job at Vacasa. I know your expectations of me is more entry level, but what can I do to show initiative? So yeah, asking at the end, or even in a follow-up email after the interview. But I would say that if you did that, also remember to thank them for their time. It's harder to get a hold of them too, because usually for a lot of companies, they interface with the recruiter, and that's sort of the middleman or the middle person who's facilitating that interview process. So if you can get them on the phone or in the moment, then that's the best way to do it. Okay, so now the part that everybody, I think, loves, hates, coding strategies and tips. So how do you tackle coding interviews? This first part will be sort of like the whole like data structures and algorithms type of questions where you've got a time limit and you have to go in, they give you a discrete problem and you have to solve it in some language. Don't learn all the languages. Pick a language, one language or two, and stick with it. If you're lucky, you'll interview with a company that says you have flexibility with what languages you choose. But the bigger point is that if you pick the languages correctly, you'll see that, I always talk about this because I think it's, when we say programming languages, and I'm like, right, languages. There are similarities between different tiers of languages. You would not, for instance, compare Java or C to Python or JavaScript. There's different paradigms with them. It's static versus interpretive. There are lots of reasons why those are different. But if you do pick a competency within a particular category of language, you'll easily find that when you go through the exercise of trying to do the same thing in another language, that you know 80% of the things that are happening. Now you're just finding out what is the idiosyncratic word that means sort in Python versus sort in JavaScript. I think the answer is actually they're the same, but maybe implemented slightly differently. And so I said Python and JavaScript versus Ruby are kind of parallel. Spanish and Italian and Portuguese. They're kind of like, think about the Romance language analogy. And again, try to port the same code from one language to another. And that's part of this exercise that I'm going to give you at the end of this presentation, is to do exactly that. And sometimes you do have to work with another company's stack, but having a strong competency somewhere will, again, have residual benefits, even if you're working with an unfamiliar technology or an unfamiliar language. Coding and computers can sometimes be crutches. So, I mean, that's weird because we're software engineers. We're coding all the time. And what I mean by that is sometimes, I don't know, how many of you have sort of like, or working on a project and you're kind of like, maybe it's Python or maybe it's JavaScript, and you're just like, you write a line of code and then you print out a console log, or you write out a line of code and you print, to just verify that the line of code did exactly the thing that you did. Can I get a show of hands as to who's done that? That sucks, and I know I'm guilty of it all the time. So this last round where I was interviewing for jobs and I was fortunate enough to get into Flux, I actually enlisted the help of my brother, who also did the whole lawyer to software engineer thing, and he forced me. Like, we met every week virtually, like on a Google Hangouts, and we did mock interviews once a week. And he would say, don't use your computer when you're writing code, because you're going to rely on checking to see whether or not you wrote every line correctly, and that's going to screw with your time management, and that's going to screw with you thinking about the bigger picture of what the code is supposed to do. Don't think about your code line to line. Come up with a plan. So that's why I say use natural language and pseudocode. And then let that hand wave away the code that you don't want to commit yet. Say you know that there's a particular code implementation, or maybe that there's 2 or 3 ways that you could do it. If you just said, I need this to sort something, then you don't have to commit to a particular sorting algorithm. You don't have to commit to using a particular data structure. If you say, I need this to be in a container that does something, as opposed to saying, I put this in an object. Now I'm like locked into the object, and I'm building code based off of that. Only after you've kind of built out the roadmap over time, then you can feel more confident in committing code, because you've got a holistic picture of what your solution is, not just I'm gonna just like meander my way through this thing and maybe I'll get to the answer. It will suck terribly at first. I felt really stupid, for a solid month. When I was doing this hardcore, in addition to my brother doing mock interviews with me once a week. You don't have to do this. I actually had time off, so this was more manageable for me at the time. I was studying like 2 to 3 hours a night, like on Leak Code or Code Wars or these websites, trying to make these algorithms work. And when I was finally like, okay, I'll go and write down a notebook, I was just like, do I not even know what these methods are? Like, am I not comfortable or confident in my ability to think Python says this in order to sort, or when I do a list, this is how I index it, or I can go and use the collections library to go and get more powerful versions of the basic data types that I have in Python. Because I didn't pull myself back, I started worrying about these little details. We really need to worry about planning, which goes into my next point. Effective time management will save you in so many ways. Practice breaking down a coding problem into discrete phases and time yourself and practice your problem solving breakdown and adhere to it. If you don't, this is not an example that you should have in terms of your exact time breakdown, but this is a skeleton that I've used sometimes when I approach a problem. And so like if I don't scope out the problem in 5 minutes and I still have questions, I just move on. Because you need to practice first that you're doing things in a time management way, because you have to trust that if you're gonna do things over and over again, you'll get better at them. You'll get more efficient at them. You have to trust that process. But if you rely on you being able to give yourself extra time as a regular thing that you're doing, then you're gonna always overshoot your time. Because you know that expectation is there. Like, oh, I can always relax and add another 2 minutes here, another 2 minutes there. And then you're at the interview and you're like, well, shoot. Like I front loaded all of my things on the first 2 steps and I never got to write a substantial amount of code. And I think I spoke with somebody in the audience about like their experience going through like Amazon, asking like an Amazon test or an Amazon type of evaluation where they had 4 problems. And I had this problem too, that this is what they drill into your head when you're studying for the bar exam, where it's all about time management. And even if you don't finish an essay, if you got the skeleton out, that's more points than if you wrote the first out of 3 arguments, because you covered all the bases. You took a shotgun approach and you have a plan and they can intuit what you were going to do at the end of the day. That's more beneficial to them being interviewers. Be visual and be vocal when you talk about your code or software. If you're describing a service you worked on, draw the components and the relationships. I mentioned this before with regard to your own personal projects, but even if they give you a hypothetical project to work on, say like create a service that does X, Y, and Z, draw it out, because then that gives you a visual cue, something tangible for you to like base the rest of your logic off of. And working in your head, typically creates a painful silence between you and the interviewer. Like as much as you're not chatting and you're talking about like what the weather's like, what you're doing this weekend, like you're in a room with somebody else. You should be able to have a conversation with them. You should be able to actually use them as a resource if maybe you're getting a little lost and you need somebody to kind of give you a nice nudge back into what they're kind of expecting in terms of a code solution. And I've taken advantage of that too. I've taken that with regard to like the last set of interviews. I interviewed at Google a few years ago, like a year ago, and it was like 5 interviews, 1-hour interviews, like with a break between the second and third interview. And the really great interviewers were the ones where the interviews were the ones where I could communicate, and I was like feeling a little lost, and then they would nudge me back. And I didn't get an offer, but like I felt at the end of the day that I understood where my weaknesses were and it was achievable. What the recruiter told me after the fact was they said that a huge highlight of mine was being able to communicate with the interviewer and get the ideation of what the code solution was. And they understood how I was approaching the problem. It was really just a matter of I didn't write the most optimal code at the time. So these are important. Like make things explicit, don't lock it in your brain. And I'm giving you an example here. Here's a thing that I made in the early hours of like 2 or 3 in the morning, fake service that kind of is similar to some of the things that we do in my company now and the last company that I was at. So as you can see here, like I have a bunch of components here, and basically how this works is, I have a database here that has some amount of data. Let's say that we'll use the payroll data example. It's a database that updates with payroll data for a company. The API here serves as sort of the contract between what a client, like what somebody who's using the client can access at any given point in time. So this is sort of the gatekeeper. And so you can see that a client, because I've drawn these arrows both ways, that the client can both get information and write information to the database. So that is one part of the service that we're describing. But in addition, I want to independently maybe produce like large amounts of analytical data based off of every interaction that's happening with this web service right now. But I don't want to hit the database with that because that will impact performance with the client. So what I did is I added a replication service to the database, which basically means every day on a schedule, I take a snapshot of the database and I move it over to this data warehouse. And the data warehouse is just a place where I'm storing tons and tons of data that's optimized so that I can read and do large amounts of querying, complex queries on it. And then I hook that up to a separate front end, a reporting dashboard. And this provides the workflow and the structure, the holistic structure for a system that you interact with to go and put in payroll data for the client, as well as a way for the company to report analytics with regard to who interacted with the system. Something I came up with in 15 minutes, thankfully, because I've at this point had so much experience making similar types of services that I can create something like this on the fly. And again, practice these things out. Like, even if you don't have code that you're referring to, think about what are the components, but don't worry about what's the code that's inside. Think about what it's supposed to do, and write out diagrams that way. Okay, so resources. This is now you getting even more nitty-gritty. So these are the specific things that I did when I was applying for coding and algorithm technicals. You got to build up your fundamentals, your data structures, and algorithms. It sucks. I mean, you're not going to use it a lot of the time at work. You're not going to be in a situation where you're going to be doing algorithms problems all the time, but they will have these weird residual benefits in terms of you building a strong foundation as an engineer in the future. So if I would say immediate ROI, maybe it's low, but like over the course of your career, you'll start to understand why they use these and then you'll understand really why it's a poor proxy for interviews. Not just it's fucking hard and absurd, but you'll know with specificity, oh, this was an inappropriate use of an algorithm or data structure type question. So here are the resources that I found useful. They're in various languages. So the first one is Eloquent JavaScript. Anybody who's had JavaScript experience, they sell a book, but there's a free website that is interactive that link is over here, where you have a nice narrative description of why JavaScript was constructed, why they chose the data types that they did, what are the limitations, and what are the benefits of creating the data types in those ways. And they have interactive consoles within that web page, that interactive web page. It's a great way for you to have a sandbox plus learn at the same time. I recommend it. I recommend it to everybody that I talk to at Alchemy Code Lab because they're a strong JavaScript stack, and I think they might use it as part of their sort of precursor to getting started with the program. I think anybody would benefit from this. Even if you've been coding for 10 years, you'll learn something interesting about it. For those of you who don't know crap about data structures and algorithms, like me, this was the first book that I got, Grokking Algorithms. It's very human readable. There's great hand-drawn illustrations. It's in Python, and it walks you through, different examples of why you would use particular types of algorithms for things, what their benefits and weaknesses are, and it presents it in a way that is sort of like they're cumulative and they build on each other. And this will not get you to performing well on an algorithms problem, but this will make you feel more comfortable when you're diving into more technical implementations of data structures and algorithms. So,
did you say you were going to make this all? I'm sorry.
Yeah, all these slides are going to be available. It's a link to Google Slides, and I emailed it to Matthias. And so, if we can make it available, that would be amazing. And then when I was starting to hardcore study from a book about understanding the nitty-gritty of bid operations or when to use dynamic programming, I used this book, Elements of Programming Interviews, which are in a ton of different languages. JavaScript, Python, Java, and so this is more of your pick your flavor, but if you go into it kind of blind without a background in data structures and algorithms, you'll feel like I did. I preemptively looked at it and was like, 2 months later, let's go, let's put this away for now. But it will help you because they walk through examples of when you use these data structures and the use cases for them. They'll give you problems in the middle of it, and then they'll have larger challenges toward the end of the chapter. But don't just rely on the books. The Code Challenge websites, like them or not, they can be very useful if you use the right one. I put in two. This Lead Code is the one that I ended up using, so I'm most familiar with that. Code Wars is one that I know that Alchemy Code Lab ends up using. What I loved about Lead Code was I ended up buying a premium subscription to it at the time, which you don't need in order to do it. It just gives you the ability to filter problems in a more granular way. So what they do is they organize problems by difficulty. They organize it by concept, so like a data structure or an algorithm or like a methodology of solving a problem. And what's great about it is, you're in a test environment and you can code in whatever languages, and you submit your code. It runs through a bunch of automated tests to see if you've passed all their edge cases, And if you pass, like they give you on the scale like what your runtime is compared to all the other submissions. And of course, people have gated systems, so don't worry too much about it. But what's also great about it is that when you answer a problem correctly, they give you access to some of the like optimal code solutions. And like people who have been using leak code a long time and want to contribute, they'll write like, this is why we use this algorithm, and this is how we implemented it, and this is why it's faster in terms of time complexity, space complexity. You may have heard of concepts like big O notation. Like they'll talk about that all the time about what is the O complexity, or like in terms of time and space. And that was kind of just great for me to be like, oh, I thought I was getting it, but here's a very specific implementation by somebody else contrasting with what I wrote in my algorithm, and now I can start to understand what the difference between me here is and what that person there is. So it's a great resource. Code Wars I've only used once, but anything that allows you to get a set of questions that you can test yourself with, they're a great resource. Unfortunately, I know that interviewers end up using websites like this as an actual like testing thing sometimes, and that I'm not so much of a big fan of. But in terms of forcing yourself to do the time management stuff and working within a coding environment, like these are great. I actually ended up taking problems, and I would take the problem, read the problem, and not use the coding interface at all. I would again do the whiteboarding or the handwriting exercise, and I followed the time limits that I set for myself. So you can use it both directly with the website, or you can go and just use it as a problem that you want to work on. For those of you who are more who are finding that you're going to interviews that are not data structure or algorithms focused, sometimes they ask you to spin up a discrete web service or some kind of a project, toy project. Maybe they give you time in advance, maybe you're doing it on the fly. But what I would say is have some libraries and frameworks in your back pocket based off of common use cases. And I don't want to recommend specific technologies because everybody's got their favorite ones, and you might have already developed some preferences with regard to what technologies you're using. And I don't want to steer you down a path where you're using a library that's incompatible with other things in your stack. But ask yourself these two forms of questions, or approach the problem in these two different ways. From the result, I want you to spin up a quick visualization to see time series data, or I want you to build me an API service that sends me dog pictures based on location on the photos, geolocation. Or ask yourself an abstract question. Is there a web framework that I have that's quick to deploy? Can I do a hello world in 10 minutes? If I'm asked to make a chart, do I have something that can make a chart? What's the simplest type of chart? What are the typical charts that people would want to see? Hopefully it's not pie charts. That's like a data joke. Everybody hates pie charts. Everybody works with data, but I use them all the time. So think about the use cases for your libraries before tackling a library. Don't just adopt fun new technology just to adopt technology. Adopt it with purpose and adopt it to help make your life easier. And this last section is about how to get this out of your head and how to get out of the room and work with other people. Either collaborate with other people and or arrange mock interviews with other people so that you are putting yourself in that stressed environment or simulated stressed environment, or you're in a safe space where you can retro or talk about a problem that you find particularly challenging with other people who find it particularly challenging. Set up an environment where you say, you and a couple of friends that you have around town or within the Tech Academy, for those of you who are students, to agree to a set of common problems that you'll work on together. Take time driving on the whiteboard or setting up a Replit or some kind of a place where people can collaborate together to start writing the code, and pepper in with suggestions in a constructive way and in a way that's meant to enrich everybody's experience. Because it's already hard enough that you have to go through this BS. Like, let's try to help support each other along the way. And with regard to mock interviews, I mean, if you can find one with like a mentor, somebody who's more senior in the industry, that's great because they'll have little bits of feedback that you would have never thought about because they've just seen more problems in the course of their experience. Again, like I said, this leverages that general tip about building relationships. If you're not building a relationship for a job, maybe you're building a relationship to ask questions about coding problems or an algorithms problem. That's something that could be immediately useful for you in the long run, even if you don't get a job with the person that you met. That's use right there. So yeah, so I mean, again, I would say like, get it out of your head, work with other people, whether or not it's in a simulated environment or a collaborative environment, because then you'll surface things that you would have never expected. Other people think about code completely differently from you, and they'll take different approaches on how to tackle a similar problem. Benefit from those experiences. That'll make you a better coder in the long run. So with the last amount of time that I have left, it's 2 o'clock, so I want to go and talk about the take-home coding challenge. You are welcome to do this or not do this. I've set up stuff so that you can communicate with me about this problem and communicate with each other about this problem. And so if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'm going to do a little bit of role playing. So this exercise is something, like I said, I give one-on-one to my ad hoc mentorships with other coding bootcamp grads. It's a little bit of an everything problem, so there's a little bit of design, there's a little bit of algorithms, there's a little bit of just plain old communication and clarifying ambiguous things. If you had been hardcore studying algorithms and data science and data structure stuff, maybe this is a problem that would take you 30 to 45 minutes to work on if you were locked into an environment and you're like, this is what I'm doing. But I give people like 2 weeks to work on this so that they can focus on applying for jobs, or they can focus on retooling their resume, or all the other important things. This is meant to kind of, again, baby step you and let you dip your toes in the water a little bit with data structures and algorithms so it doesn't seem so impossible. So here is the challenge. You're going to be given by a task by a senior engineer who's transitioning to product manager. So as a result, their instructions may therefore be vague or subject to interpretation, so it's up to you to ask follow-up questions. Assume nothing, plan out accordingly, and good luck. And I will now role play the role of the senior engineer. Okay, so as you know, our product is an image processor that can read suits and values off a deck of playing cards. Unfortunately, the output of the processor are 2 arrays, one of suits and one of values, in the order that they were processed. So if there were 3 cards and the first card was the king of diamonds, one array would have K as the first element, and the other array would have D as the first element. We want you to make a function that will merge these arrays into a single data structure, because why would I want to play with 2 arrays when I can have a single thing that I can access and not manage, like indexes or anything like that in a disjointed way? Here are some of my requirements. So the structure should be able to access a specific card, the third card, and access the specific card's properties, the third card's suit, or the third card's value, in an engineering-friendly way. You can interpret that however you want. Oh, and in addition to merging this thing, I want you to give me the option of sorting these deck of cards in one of 4 ways. Meaning that you have to do all 4, but I get to choose. So you can sort it by their value, so numerical value or whatever value, by suit, by value, then within the value, the suits, and then by suit, and then the value. And of course, I want an option to not sort it. So I want plain Jane, and I want fancy sorting algorithm. Another thing, I want you to present this to me in 2 different languages. But you can't just make 2 different, completely different languages. They have to be kind of similar because we're deciding on how we want to implement this. And I don't want to choose between Java and Ruby. I want to choose between JavaScript and Python, or JavaScript and Ruby, or JavaScript and PHP. Also, you can't use any built-in sorting functions for the languages you choose. No using .sort, no using sort helper methods. You have to build the sorting algorithm yourself. And I don't need it to be the fastest, but I just want you to discuss with me. If you ended up giving me the slowest, quote unquote, sorting algorithm, just tell me about why it's slow and tell me about why you ended up using it. Maybe it's time, maybe it's because you just wanted it was simple and the code was cleaner. Just give me the reason, and give me a rational reason for me to understand why you made that decision. And I want you to also, after you've implemented this in 2 languages, discuss sort of what you thought were interesting similarities and interesting differences between them, so that I can get a better sense of what's better to implement, what are we losing, what are we gaining, are we gaining anything, are we losing anything? These are the things that I want to know. So if you have any questions, hit me up on my Deck of Cards channel on the Slack workspace. That's a link in the slides. When you get the slides, you will have this link. I can only respond once a day. This is only because I will be the guy who's looking at shiny things and be like wanting to answer everybody's things. So I'm intentionally limiting myself to communicating once a day for this project. So think about what you want to ask. When you have a solution, post it on Slack or in that channel too. I use Replit to kind of demo code. So if you've used Replit or CodePen or something where I can execute the algorithm and see that it works, that would be awesome. And then maybe what we can do is we can have conversations on Slack to kind of talk about an ongoing discussion about why people chose different implementations of things. And maybe create, hopefully, if enough people are interested, to have a collaborative environment where we're all in a safe space working on this problem together. So that's it. Good luck and thanks. Happy Valentine's Day. And I'll be here for the next, I guess like we're reserved until 2:30. Like if you want to ask me questions about the problem or ask me questions about my background, I'm more than happy to take those now. Yep.
So I'm curious about how you're talking about the Google interview.
Yep.
How you were very effective with your communication over with the coding problems. Like, could you go more in depth with like a concrete example?
Sure. So the question was, I had talked about in the Google interview about how I was able to be an effective communicator and how was I, if I could give a more concrete example of what that communication style was. So one example that they gave, one interview question that they gave me had to do with sort of like what was the most efficient way to grab like bikes in a field. Like if you had GPS and all that sort of stuff, and there's people randomly dispersed on a field. So what I did was I physically drew out the grid, and I like put like like dots or symbols that represented people versus representing bicycles. And when I didn't have an algorithm in my mind, I would just sort of like fiddle around with, okay, so if I went and selected this, that means I would have to, the most efficient way for somebody to get to a bike would be this. And I would actually just like trial and error when I was trying to figure out what algorithm would work to kind of figure out like, okay, like is this the right approach that I'm taking? I also spoke out loud and talking about what were the limitations, and I would ask questions. For instance, I would say, what happens if there's a tie? Like what happens if there are two people who are equally far away from the same bike? How do I determine who gets the bike? And they would maybe give me saying like, okay, just assume that it's random, or just assume that it's the person who's alphabetically the first name or whatever. And so that was something I had to implement to code. So by asking questions, I would go and follow up and find out all these different requirements that I didn't know I had at the time. Or they would just say, assume that whole situation will never occur. They'll scope the question out appropriately. I had another problem during that interview where they were talking about, what was it? It was like, I want to create logs, and I want to create an API that like does like time-based logs or something like that. And sometimes there's like a race condition where like I'm getting multiple inputs for like at similar timestamps or the right timestamps. How do I put them in order? Or maybe I'm collecting timestamps from one location, I'm collecting timestamps from the other location, I'm storing them up for a day, and then I'm combining them together. And so like I have to resolve order of time, even though they're listed, they're already like written in a way that's sort of like in chronological order within their sets. So I would ask questions, for instance, like, like what is the shape of the data? Is it, are they in strings? Are they in objects? How frequently should I expect for me to have to update data from each source? Are there any other sorts of tiebreaker situations that I need to worry about if the timestamps are exactly the same? And just working through the problems there. It's just like sort of like pulling at the proverbial thread and unraveling the sweater. That's kind of what you have to do. Just role play a lot of the investigator role, and it's just something that you'll get better with over time. And that's why, again, I highly encourage being in a collaborative space where somebody asks things in a vague way, so that you can follow up and ask questions. You want to be able to rely on the fact that you're not going to get 100% of the information, and that you have to go and get the extra 5% or the extra 10% of it. Yes?
Yeah, I guess I know a lot of jobs or interviews require you the question like, what do you want out of a job with us too? And like, how do you sort of tackle that, or what's a good way to approach?
Sure. So the question was, like when you're in an interview, how do you answer the question of like, what are you looking for in a job, or what are you looking for career. But let me just ask you honestly, what are you looking for in a career? Like what brought you down this path?
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, I guess there's a lot of things that's individual. That's my question. I guess it's individual for everyone. So that's but yeah, for me personally, I guess it's it's a field that interests me, and it's allows for something that allows for a modicum of flexibility and stability and all that stuff. So
Okay. So like what I'm hearing from you just from this initial conversation is that a lot of the benefits that comes from working at this type of job, is something that's highly desirable. And so maybe you're a little bit more flexible about the type of work you work on. So that's fine. I mean, that's okay. I mean, everybody is at the end of the day needing to make a paycheck. But if you know that you're going to be down this path anyway, I mean, go through the exercise of asking yourself, what are some idiosyncratic or weird things or interesting things that make you you and that you like? And if you had the ideal job as a software engineer, like what would you be working on? That would both give you the pay. Assume the pay issue's all good. You've got stable pay, stable benefits. What are the extra things that would make your job not the perfect job, but like a good and fulfilling job? And then work backwards from there and see how technology is able to affect and impact those interests of yours.
okay, yeah, great.
I'm sorry, I'm really curious about the interviewing process.
Sure.
Because I don't have any experience with it. But how often is there like times where you get stuck in the code problem and you just admit like I don't know what I'm doing? And do they give you like little tidbits and then maybe you can continue a little further? Or maybe sometimes you just don't understand it at all and they're like, well, might as well take this time to just explain the whole thing because I have nothing better to do.
Right. So like I mentioned at the very beginning, so the question was like, can I speak a little bit more as to the structure of typical types of interviews, maybe interviews that I've experienced or I've conducted. And again, like I said, there's a variety of them, but if you want to talk about, I guess, major themes, sometimes there is a a lot of times there's a time-limited coding challenge. Maybe that's an on-site or maybe that's a take-home. When it's on-site, it's maybe like an hour and a half or whatever, and it'll be like a discrete problem that you're working on. And I've had situations where I've sat in on an interview and we've hired somebody where we said, like spin up, here's some data, spin up a graph for this, and spin up a web, like a web page for this. And they got the hello world and they were like, oh, I don't have a visualization library, but you can see that I have the data that I can display it just as data within the web page. So we said, okay, well then how would you approach it saying that you did know what a library was? And the candidate, she went up and she wrote a chart and a hypothetical chart and how you would interact it with if a window popped up that allowed you to edit part of the chart, she would draw the window and do that. And within that time limitation, she was like, yeah, I can't finish the last 30% of this coding problem. Hired. We were thoroughly impressed that she was able to pivot and be able to think about what the stakeholder was looking for at the end of the day, how the hypothetical user was going to use the product. So again, start from the forest and think about what is the problem you're trying to solve, what are the fundamental interactions that you're going to have in order to make this a successful service. And then you can start figuring out what are the little pieces that I can do in code. And then you can say, well, for this piece, I know that I can work on this part of the code, and this is how I would approach it. But I'm going to hand wave this way because I honestly don't have a library on the back of my hand in order to create the chart, so I can't write the code for you. But I can tell you the types of charts that I would be interested in and I think would be useful for an analysis. And I could imagine how the user would interact with. If you wanted to give me more feedback about that, I'd love to ask some follow-up questions and have that conversation. So you don't have to actually, I shouldn't say that, you should strive to write code when you're in a coding interview. But if you feel flustered because you're at a stopping point, pivot. Illustrate it out, write it out, talk it out. It's better than just sitting there and not doing anything. And at least it will start making your brain process a little bit about, if I was in the next interview, how would I change this process? Or I have ideas about what's something that's useful for me to learn. Take everything as a learning experience. And I know it's really tough because you're trying to get a job, you haven't, you're working full-time studying, or you haven't had a job in a while, but you're already in the moment. So you have to kind of just embrace that you're in the moment and take it for the opportunity that it is as a learning exercise. Yeah.
So getting a mentor, kind of that topic. How do you kind of move from just like someone you know and you've networked with into more of a mentorship type of relationship?
Yeah. You kind of have to feel it out a little bit. I mean, sometimes it's tough to. You can't go similarly. You can't go right off the bat and be like meet somebody and cold call them and be like, hey, I'd love for you to be a mentor. You know, like take them to a coffee, wine and dine them a little with 4 coffees. You know, like in a very professional way. Get to know who that person is and figure out if this is somebody that you would like to spend time with. Don't just pick a mentor because they're available. Pick a mentor that has some sort of compelling story that resonates with you or something that interests you about them. And you know, like just with any relationship, when you make a friend, when you have a loved one, like you need to kind of organically feel out what the parameters of those relationships are. And you know, like maybe it's after the 4th or 5th coffee, or maybe it's after half a year where you're like, hey, have you ever thought about like mentoring? Like I've asked you a lot of questions and you've been really helpful. Maybe we can do something that's a little bit more structured. Is that something you'd be interested in? You know, like find the opportunity in sort of an organic way. But if worst comes to worst, find a program. Yeah.
What are kind of like, what is your responsibility in data engineering? What kind of tools do you use throughout your day-to-day?
Yeah, so as a data engineer, so most of our system that has nothing to do with data engineering side is, you know, like JavaScript, Node, in terms of the API, Node and Express, Vue on the front end. We use a variety of libraries and third-party platforms to do visualization. So we'll use like AmCharts, but we'll also plug in with platforms like Mode, which is the data analytics platform. Primarily with regard to my responsibilities, so we have a data pipeline, and it was originally written in JavaScript, but now it's kind of split between JavaScript and Python. And I think we're going to be migrating it entirely to Python just because of some of the benefits of miscomprehension. Python's just generally better for over JavaScript for a lot of data science applications. And so what happens is we generate a bunch of data from the database that gets stored in a data warehouse. We use Snowflake, which is a popular cloud data warehousing solution that's parallelized, optimized. It has all kinds of nice little benefits. Its language is very similar to Postgres for those of you who worked with Postgres. And so we just pump a bunch of data and we'll put it either through Amazon on AWS S3 for like temporary storage and CSV files, or we'll migrate it to this data warehouse and then move it to this platform that we use, which is called Mode, which has a SQL query editor. It also has the ability to put in notebooks so you can process a SQL query afterwards using Python or R, and you can generate reports using a combination of their baked-in visualizations. You can also use JavaScript as well as Python or R libraries for visualizations and like move them into an HTML, CSS, JavaScript template that the report is constructed out of. And you can schedule runs, run runs ad hoc. There's all kinds of nice little functionalities, but at the same time, there's some compromises, mainly with the scale of the company at the time. They're a very small team, so when we were always begging for new features, but you know, like they're not exactly there yet. So we're kind of like working hand in hand in terms of like, hey, what can you give us? Yeah.
That was my next question. Was like, how big is that team? That's a lot of tools to work with.
Yeah. So I mean, so in terms of data engineering at my company, it's the CTO, me, and one senior data engineer. So it's 3 of us primarily working on data ingestion. It's actually like once we built out the structure, we spent a few months like really talking about the design and talking about the pipeline, making mistakes along the way. There are some mistakes that I'm just like, I wish we had not committed to this thing, but we'll have to resolve that at some point. And yeah, it's just the 3 of us. Question?
How would you recommend making, say, like a repository that you can reflect back on for code and algorithms?
Yep.
To like, so if you're working on multiple languages or if you're just focusing on one, like
Yep.
how to organize when you feel like you've got a good set of things that work, how to organize that so you can use it later.
For sure. I have my GitHub account. I have a repo that's basically a bunch of Jupyter notebooks. I code in Python, and so I went through every chapter in that programming interviews book for Python, the Elements of Programming Interviews book, the EPI. And I would write chapter by chapter, here's the exercise, bullet point 1.2, and I would try to write out the algorithm, and I would run it and see, like maybe if I wanted to time how effective it was, I would put a timer on it and see. And then so I had this generated notebook that I preserved, that I version controlled onto a repository, and that's how I would track my progress as I was going through the 2 months of intense algorithms prep.
And that's stuff that you refer back to or you pull from, that
Yeah.
kind of thing? Okay.
Yeah, so sometimes, for instance, if I remember one time I was learning about a problem called the n-queen problem, n-queens problem, which is basically you have a chessboard and you have to organize queens on the board so that no queen can eat another queen, right? So it's like a backtracking problem. So I worked on this problem and I saved it and I was like, cool, I worked on it, I solved this thing, the implementation is fine. And then a few weeks later, I had another problem that reminded me of an n-queens problem, and I was like, but I don't remember how I implemented that out. So I went back to my notebook, and I copied that code, and then I put it into another notebook, and I tried to fiddle around with it and try to figure out if my intuition on it was right, whether or not it was a backtracking problem in that style. So yeah, so I would refer back to my notebooks all the time, and it's just file organization at that point, right? Like when you're on your computer, you're chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Yeah.
When you're just getting started with whiteboarding problems and algorithms, you said the rocking
algorithms.
Rocking, excuse me, that's a verb. Algorithms is that where you start? Is that the starting point you started at, or did you do some easy problems on LeetCode before?
So I tried using some of the easy problems, and there were certain things that just because I had been a software engineer for a year and some change, I was like, oh yeah, I know how to reverse a string or something like that. But at some point I was like, wow, these easy problems are taking an hour for me to do because I am just fundamentally starting from let's figure it out as opposed to I know a methodology or a strategy. And so what happened was when I started reading that Grokking Algorithms book, then I was like, oh, this is the big picture. There are these categories of algorithms that I need to understand. And I need to understand what are the real power and benefits of certain types of data structures that are already baked into Python. I never really used, when I was at my first job, we didn't use Python extensively within our code base. It was sort of more an analytics or data tool, so I never got to use, really take advantage of things like the collections library or iter tools, or some of these things that are the bread and butter of vanilla Python developers until I started working on data structures and algorithms problems. And I was like, oh, these are really powerful. And, they totally helped me understand what are the limitations of just using the standard data type for a list or a dictionary versus using an ordered dict or a default dict. There are things that I was just I just used it the other day for code because I was translating something that was using data science libraries that we can't use when we're productionizing it because we're using AWS Lambda to deploy our code on demand in a serverless environment, and so they have a size limitation, and the packages to use those data science libraries are 2/3 of the size of the code base. So I don't want to use them. I want to use vanilla Java or vanilla Python. So yeah, they're as a process of learning and reading through Grokking Algorithms, it gave me a much stronger appreciation of the fundamentals of that coding language.
So it's kind of a combination between doing the easy problems and learning.
Right. Don't try to approach things with strict orthodoxy. I'm giving you these things as these are the touch points that I went through, but you need to also realize that you're not me and I'm not you, and you might gravitate towards one side or one set of strategies more than I did. So it's really kind of, again, here's the buffet. What works for you? And then if you still are trying to figure things out, who can I talk to? Who can provide me some additional guidance, or just the rubber duck and just hear what I have to say? That's kind of what we're doing right now, is we're trying to figure out what are the strategies that work for you out of all the strategies that I've kind of laid out today.
Do you have any specific names of groups that would be good to get involved in if you're trying to break into the industry? You're looking for mentorship or just coding groups?
Yeah.
Do you recommend?
I mean, PDX Wit, amazing. They're super well organized group, and they have a mentorship program. They do lots of things with facilitating new people who are entering into the tech industry, where they'll have a lightning here's 20 seconds for me to introduce myself in front of this huge crowd, They have a monthly happy hour. They have mentorship programs. I think they have like scholarship stuff too. Women Who Code is another organization that I haven't worked directly with, but that's also in a similar lines of like these affinity organizations that are meant to like, especially to take people from non-traditional backgrounds and be like, hey, let's realize that software engineers are not a monolith, and let's all try to like appreciate the different perspectives that we're coming into when we're working on code and software engineers together. I guess if you're interested in a particular technology, I know that the PDX Know group seems to be pretty popular. Metal Toad does that like mentorship Saturdays where you can come in and write Python code, and it's like once every couple of weeks or something, you go to the Metal Toad office and you just work with developers there, about a project that you're working on. And it really is just kind of going to meetup.com and seeing what interests you. And I've had both really great experiences and ones that were just not in line with what I was interested in. Like one of the first things I did when I was here was I went to a meetup group about like individual web developers, and I was just not into that lifestyle of like making web pages for a living for other people and like running my own business in that specific way. But I got to meet some cool people who reinforced that it was not the right choice for me, and that was valuable just to cross that off of my list of like possible career paths.
What was the PDX, the very first one you said?
PDX Women in Tech.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Any other questions? All right, really good talk. Thanks, Chris.
All right, so I have just a few announcements before you guys head out. Actually, anyone else here have announcements that they want to share about what's going on in the community? Okay. All right. So next week, we have someone from a meetup group that meets here every other Tuesday right now. Python Pirates, I've mentioned them before. That's an awesome group to get involved in. They have tons of coding challenges and like talks every other week, and it's a very collaborative space. So check out their meetup page. But one of the people who runs that group is going to come in and talk. He's only going to give like a 30-minute talk. So if there's anybody who wants to give like a lightning presentation, a couple of minutes, you want to share a project that you're working on, come talk to me. We'll set it up. Also, I know there's a few gamers in here. They have a gameplay testing at the CASA for a game jam that just happened. So people made a bunch of games in 2 days. So I'm going to be going to that on the 22nd. If there's any students or anyone else that wants to come, link up with me. And is anyone hiring in here? Anyone hiring? Okay, no. Just good to ask because we have a lot of students.
If you say yes.